how can we get the American people to be less excited about going to war in Ukraine? That's sort of the question. Why do they do it? Anyway, you keep up with the polls. You like polling numbers.
Polls.
You must have taken a lot of math and like statistics and things.
Only when they go our way. That's the only time I like
Okay,
them.
but the polls have been shifting. We've had some reports here in the last couple months, and it's been slow in coming to get really good polling on COVID. But it looks like the shift in public attitude that the deep state's allowed to get out into the media. It isn't only a few of us reporting on this. This is getting into the regular media, and this is an AP polling thing that we want to talk about. And we have had several polls, but the direction is important. There's less and less enthusiasm by the American people for going to war and continuing this war in Ukraine. Now, I would say, well, it's less than perfect. It doesn't have the same arguments we have, a little bit of pragmatism, but the pragmatism is worthwhile, and that diminishes the warmongers. And that is the pragmatism. The American people are disgusted with it because they've sensed what they should sense from the history of the world all time, is that wars don't go well, and they're hurtful to the average person. And this is what they're saying. The average person now, when they're polled, they say, what's going on here? Well, almost $1 trillion we've sent over there, and we keep sending it, and they're talking about it. And Biden says we're going to stay there until, we have total victory, and the Russians have gone home, and that sort of thing. But the people are saying, well, maybe not. We have enough problems. And they're starting, it's a reflection that our economy is not nearly as rosy as the reports are on television, because they always say, oh, well, there's not that much inflation, it's getting better, and all that double talk that they have. But anyway, the people are shifting to saying enough is enough. Maybe we want to help them a little bit. We certainly from the beginning didn't want to send troops, but they were sending a lot of money and a lot of weapons, cost a lot of money, and guess what? There's neglect of some of the problems we have in this country. Where's the buckets of money? Oh, we're sorry, we can't do that. We've sent all the buckets of money to Ukraine, but I'd like to look it up and find out how much good we did, but we can't find the money. Well, who benefited by that? Oh, there's a little bit of corruption over there, and people stole it, and which is natural in all the wars. I've always argued against foreign aid because nobody has audits of foreign aid, and it usually ends up in the bad people who are the enemies that we're trying to restrain. But anyway, this little poll shows that the shift is in the direction the American people are getting tired, and we want to encourage them.
This is bad news for the Biden administration and for the Republicans, the mainline Republican Party, which has always been pro-war, has never seen a war it doesn't like, because it shows the continued moving away from support for this war. We can put up this just came out yesterday. They've been tracking this from the very beginning, almost a year ago. Ukraine aid support softens in the U.S., AP NORC poll. Now, one of the things we talked about just before the show started, AP has been very, very pro-Ukraine and very, very pro-war. So it must physically pain them to support, to show this absolutely shrinking support. And if we can put on the next clip, this tells you just in numbers what's happening. 48% say they favor U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine, with 29 opposing, 22 saying neither. So less than half of Americans now support sending weapons into Ukraine. That's down from May of 22, when 60% of Americans were in favor. So from an almost two-thirds majority down to a minority approving sending more weapons to Ukraine. And let's look at some of the, hold on, Americans are about evenly divided on sending government funds, only 30% in favor of sending money to Ukraine, 38% opposed. And this is all Americans. This is the Biden people who love this, all Americans. So support is disintegrating across the board. Let's do the next one and look at some of these numbers. Now, I apologize. If I had drawn the chart, I would have tried to make it a little bit more easy. Maybe I'm not that good at math. But these were questions asked about what should be a bigger priority for America in response to Russia's invasion. One, sanctioning Russia as effectively as possible, even if it damages the economy, Or 2, limiting damage to the economy, even if it means sanctions are less effective. And on the left, you see the tabs from March of 22, and that's when the invasion had just started. That's when propaganda was at volume 11. And so you see on the left side, among green is overall, blue is Democrat, and red is Republican, you see very much heavily skewed toward the left, which is sanctioning Russia as effectively as possible, limiting damage to the economy. Republicans were more in favor of that, but overall you see that very much people were in favor of sanction. You move over to January 23, which is the right part of this chart, and you see that all the momentum has shifted to limiting damage to the economy. Americans are seeing that these things are not as cost-free as they thought they were, and the tide is shifting to an absolute majority. And among Republicans, almost 70% of Republicans do not want to damage the economy for Russia. Next tab really quick. Sorry, Dr. Paul, but I just want to get this next one in before I change. Large partisan differences. They always want to emphasize this. I'm not sure about this. Large partisan differences in confidence in Biden's ability to handle the war. And actually, in this sense, it's true. Because overall, only 19% of Americans have a great deal of confidence that Biden can manage this war. And among his own party, only 40%, way less than half, think that he can handle this. Among Republicans, only 2%, and that's Bill Kristol and his family, who believe, maybe he's not even a Republican anymore, who believe that Biden can manage this affair. The numbers are brutal for this administration and the hawkish Republicans.
You know, in economics or in foreign policy, acceleration and momentum is very important. And I would say the momentum is in the right direction. So what we want to do is accelerate more and more momentum so there's more people shifting. And I think we witnessed that and talked about it when the people were waking up about the COVID, the so-called epidemic. So, but I think the American people, when they look at this and become more opposed to it, I think this is just a guess in a way, that they're concerned about infrastructure, building roads, and, you know, so-called legitimate government expenditures, and also the borders. That's very real. And they say, well, we're neglecting our borders, and they sense that. But, you know, one thing I don't think they pay much attention to, but they ought to add one more item, and that is in price inflation. When the cost of living goes up, I don't think they connect that with Ukraine as much, but when you look at items in the budget, it's a big item because it's so big and it's so mishandled and there's no audits and all. So the military and industrial complex in bidding this up is very harmful. So if the American people also added their concerns from the borders and other is, cost of living in some ways is related to spending in Ukraine. Wow, maybe we could give a little acceleration to the momentum about changing those policies.
Yeah, everything has always been cost-free, at least in their mind, because as you would always say, they don't see it because it's hidden in inflation. But now they're seeing it. And I think every American should look at this chart, because I think anyone who looked at this next chart would say, why us? Why do we have to bear this massive burden of funding this war? And this is a list of donors, the largest donors of military aid to Ukraine. And if you look at this chart, you see that the U.S. financial support is off the chart by far, 10 times more than Germany, the next highest level, nearly 10 times as much. This is all coming out of our economy, and I think Americans would say, for what? What are we getting out of this? The answer is nothing, and I think this is not from that poll, but I just dug that graphic out because it shows so graphically the massive, overwhelming commitment that the United States government and the Biden administration has made to this war. Americans are not buying it.
Well, I think there's a reason for that, because they don't think about NATO the same way we think about NATO. And what they do is they think of war. Well, there's a war going on, yes, and we're involved in helping, but because the Russians invaded and they're destroying Ukraine. Well, that's oversimplified and wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and here it is. When they talk about support, what's NATO doing and these other countries participating, I think of, we should talk more about NATO, disobeying their own promises about where they were going to put weapons before they provoked Russia. So that is one thing they have to consider. But no, they don't consider that, and they design a war. It's Ukraine against Russia, and the Americans help. But I see it as when you see this, NATO involvement. Well, we're NATO.
Yeah.
We're NATO, and we put the money in, and then they avoid the subject. But the people are right. It's our money. I think they're starting to realize we're providing these weapons, and I just think it's worse than they ever even thought about. Mainly because it affects a lot more than infrastructure.
And even if everything the other side said is true, that Russia in an unprovoked way woke up one morning and decided to invade its neighbor, that still would not make the case for our involvement at all. Ukraine is not a NATO member. We have no obligation, legal or moral, to support Ukraine. So even if the worst case scenario, that still would not make the case. As we point out from the beginning, the claims are not correct. There is a lot more to it than this, but even so, it wouldn't make the claim. Well, let's move on to a related topic, and if we can put that up, this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Here it has a good little summary about, and this is some more fallout from the Seymour Hersh article. Russia requests UN Security Council meeting over Nord Stream report. Seymour Hersh, who they're doing their best to ignore, as we talked about on the show, Dr. Paul Blockbuster report detailing exactly how the Biden administration blew up the pipeline. And in light of this report, the Russians, who are members of the UN Security Council, have requested a meeting. And this is a statement of Russia's first deputy representative to the UN. He said, in light of new information regarding the bombing of the Nord Stream gas pipelines, we have requested a UN Security Council meeting to be held on February 22nd at 3 p.m. New York time. And so they want the UN Security Council to get to the bottom. This kind of tricky situation for the U.S. They've denied it. Totally untrue, no truth at all to it. Kind of like they denied Hersh's story about Abu Ghraib. Totally untrue, nothing to it. Turns out to be true. I think they're in panic mode in Washington over this.
Yeah, and back to the emphasis, it should be that if we're trying to soften the blow and reduce the warmongering stuff going on, they have to realize that this is a war between the United States and Russia. And but no, for our benefit, and even Russia diplomatically, maybe they want to blame NATO too. But the accusations about that pipeline was just off, and there was another threat, by the Russians. Yesterday I said, they really haven't talked that much about it. I'm surprised they haven't done much. But I think there was a very explicit warning yesterday, and this might be that they're covering themselves.
Yeah.
They're going to go and have their last effort with NATO and see what they do. But we own NATO, so how can you expect the solution to come from there? It was NATO that pushed those troops up on the Russian border, which we said we wouldn't do. And it's us that provided all the funds, and then the unbelievable complicated mess with that oil line that they literally went in and destroyed it. I think, well, that's out in the ocean someplace, and that was from Germany. It has nothing to do with attacking Russia.
Yeah.
Boy, that was like hitting Moscow almost. I think diplomatically that's what it did, and that's why, and that's also the reason now Blinken is sort of thinking maybe we should demand that the Ukrainians go in there and lose a couple more 100,000 people and take back eastern Ukraine. And he's saying, well, maybe we should just wait on that. Well, that means there is a big concern, but it's also Biden said he is not going to do anything and talk about any about peace until they get all that land back.
Yeah.
So they're stalemate now. We need this momentum. Churn it up. Yeah. American people, wake up. Get these people. Yeah. I used to talk about bringing the troops home. We should never send them. Yeah. And then if they do go, get them home. If we don't need to have our special forces and our CIA and NATO forces and hiding behind there, just wanting to be in the middle of another war. I think we're still have something going on in Syria. Yeah. We left the Middle East, sort of, and now we're in Syria. That's a big deal. But they have oil. But here we have to participate in this because this is a big deal. But it's Russia. It's Russia. We got to stop the Russians. If we get tired of that, or they get tired, well, we always have China.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a big fan of what impeachment has become, but if what Hersh has written is accurate and true, this is a blatantly illegal act by the Biden administration. You have committed an act of war against another country's infrastructure. You've blown it up without the required consultation with Congress. You know, there's a format where there's a group of members in the House and the Senate who are informed of covert actions like this before they're undertaken. That form did not take place. This was undertaken, from what we understand from Hersh's reporting, without the notification, without the input from the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate, a blatantly illegal act of war against another country. I think if there are any Republicans in the House with any courage, they will immediately start looking into this and looking into probably a legitimate reason to impeach the President of the United States over this.
You know, you make the point, there's no declaration of war, but that's incidental, and they're not likely to be listening to you.
Yeah.
And but the whole thing is how to do that was technologically and planning that took some effort. Well, who is this? Oh, it's mysterious. It's called secret government. It's called the CIA. And don't you know there was a coup in this country, and the CIA and the special forces do what they want, and they totally are excluded, and the media cooperates with them until the people start to wake up. And that's why, yes, hopefully the Republicans will wake up and do more than they have in the past. But we do know that they're divided on it as well, and if they do something right at this moment, it's going to be slow and tedious. But that's what has to happen. But it isn't. But this is. You make this point about, Congress didn't give permission. This is an act of war. Yeah. But how long have we been doing that? For what, 60-some years, and we've been doing this, and we just go about it and start another war. And how do we start the wars? Decisions made by the CIA, and they send in, but even that started before before the more recent time. In '53 is when I think this really got started and out of hand, where things were done like that, and we live with the bad consequences of it. And, even the consequences with Iran has to do with Russia and China now, that are, when the chance comes where they might be able to undermine the dollar, and if we continue with our economic policy, it might not be too difficult to undermine the dollar. We may do that all by ourselves.
Yeah, well, the threshold for covert actions is much lower, of course, than an act of war. It only requires a notification of a certain group of senators and members of the House, and that forget about declaration of war. That notification didn't take place, which is illegal. But on the UN, to finish up on that, let's skip the next one and go directly to that tweet that I had up. This is Gonzalo Lira. He reports on the Ukraine war from Kharkov inside Ukraine. And he made a good point. I have to give him credit because I was going to steal it anyway. But he makes a good point about the Russians calling for a UN Security Council hearing on this, because he said this is a trap for the West. If they agree to the UN Security Council meeting, then the U.S. will be shown to be responsible for the Nord Stream terrorist attack. If they refuse, it will discredit the UN and show it to be a Western war justification engine. So in a way, it's kind of a checkmate, because they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't on this. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens when this hearing convenes next week.
We may learn something that will be beneficial to waking up the people.
Yeah.
But probably, if it's really valuable information that would help wake up the people, it will be done very quietly.
Nobody will report it.
Oh, what meeting are you guys talking about?
There was no meeting.
You guys you worry too much.
Well, let's move on to another aspect of the deep state and put on this next clip, because here is the dark figure on our horizon for years. This is a report that came out earlier this month in the Epoch Times. Inside the secret government meeting on COVID-19 natural immunity, there was a meeting convoked by Fauci and his top aides to discuss the issue of whether people who've had COVID, if that counts as one of their shots. Fascinating, and it's fascinating that it was done in secret. This should be a scientific inquiry. Instead, it looked like a political discussion.
You know, some people wanted to make an excuse, say, well, they're just stupid. They didn't get the right education in medical school. But I think the contest for explaining this is, are they stupid? Is this why they did that? And they really believe this stuff? The pharmaceutical industry said, well, you don't have to, worry about natural immunity. That doesn't really exist. Or the other choice is they're evil.
Yeah.
And the odds of evilness is greater than the stupidity. But what happens if you combine them? And that is what's happening. But the whole idea that they had this meeting, I think this should be really big news to get together, because we were talking about this all the time, but we had no evidence that they actually planned it, and it wasn't an accident that all the bad guys who got into bed with the government in the medical profession. And the worst thing is the medical profession did this. They went along with this.
Yeah.
Except for hopefully more and more will come out now, because there were certainly some good friends on our side in the medical profession who had to suffer the consequence because they spoke out.
Yeah. Well, on the government side, who attended this secret meeting was Fauci, of course, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was a U.S. Surgeon General, Rochelle Walensky, remember her, head of the CDC, Francis Collins, head of the National Institutes of Health, and Dr. Bachara Chukolt, the White House vaccine coordinator. And they brought in outside experts, including the notorious Dr. Peter Hotez, right? Remember him? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, but what about, did Fauci get invited?
No, he was there. He could, oh, yeah, okay.
I want to make it point.
Yeah, he was there.
He probably organized it.
Yeah. So they brought in this kook from Dallas, Hotez, is that his name? And the discussion was, and Hotez was saying, natural immunity means nothing. You have to get all your shots, Deus Vult or whatever. So it was pretty amazing,
They took a vote from Pfizer. They had a couple extra votes, and Pfizer's, well, our bottom line. What do you think we're doing? Do you think we're doing this out of generosity? We have a bottom line. We have stockholders to satisfy.
Yeah.
What a mess.
Well, one of the people that we followed throughout the COVID era and who gave us such great statistics, such great analysis, and we're grateful too, is Justin Hart. And he put out a little tweet about this earlier this month, and I think it summarizes it quite well. If we can put that up, the next one actually, if you can. There we go. This is Justin Hart. This is important. Hotez bolstering Fauci to dismiss natural immunity. Offit and Osterholm suggesting it should have some credence. Limit to 2 shots. Hotez and Fauci are awful rogues. So very, very good. From Justin Hart to describe it.
Okay.
Here's the next story, though, and it's kind of a sad story. And I think, if you don't mind, we'll start with a video clip.
Okay.
And this is the football player, Damar Hamlin, who's dramatically on Monday Night Football, his heart stopped. Now, he's talking to Michael Strahan, who's a football legend, and Strahan is now a journalist, and he's asking him, what happened, Damar? What happened? Let's listen into that first 31 or so seconds.
From the ICU, the question on so many minds, what caused his heart to stop beating?
You're 24, peak physical condition, can run circles around me right now. How did doctors describe what happened to you?